Hello everybody, in this video we'll be taking a look at the SNES Classic and talk about whether or not Nintendo's mini emulation-based console is a viable alternative to the original Super Nintendo and the amazing and fairly expensive Super NT. The SNES Classic comes in a nice box similar to that of the old original Super Nintendo boxes. Included with the system are two controllers, an HDMI cable and a USB cable which can be used with any USB charger, or it could draw power from your TV if your TV has USB ports. And most importantly, the SNES Classic has 21 built-in games, but we'll talk about the games or lack thereof a little bit later. For now, let's focus on the system's physical appearance and overall design. The SNES Mini is a beautifully crafted replica of the original Super Nintendo. Much like the original, the Japanese and European variations of the system share that same beautiful sleek design, whereas the American version once again has its rather rough and less sophisticated look. It's a small yet rather sturdy and very comfortable to hold console with two functional buttons. You have the reset button and the on and off switch, which feels remarkably like that of the actual original SNES. The cartridge slot and the eject button, of course, are there just for show. They're just there to make the system look more authentic. And of course are non-functional because the SNES Classic does not take cartridges. And the nicely textured matte finish further improves the system's physical appearance. The controllers the SNES Classic comes with both look and feel identical to those of the original Super Nintendo. From their buttons to the D-pad, their texture, these are high-quality Super Nintendo controllers through and through and are indistinguishable from the original controllers on the old system. They're just as comfortable to play with, if not more so, since they're new, and we haven't experienced that brand new SNES controller feel in decades. And unlike the NES Classic controllers, these have much longer cords. The SNES Classic has its own proprietary controller ports. Rather, it uses the same type of controller ports that are used on the Wii for the Classic controller. So this means that right out of the box, you cannot plug your original SNES controllers in and expect them to work. However, if you so desire, there are adapters out there you can purchase that will allow you to do just that. It's clear that a lot of genuine love and care went into crafting this SNES Classic's physical appearance. But what of the selection of games the system has to offer? Now let's get one thing out of the way first. I own the majority of the games on the SNES Classic on actual original cartridges. The only games I don't have are a legit version of Earthbound, Punch-Out, because I don't care about that game one bit, and I don't have the Super Nintendo version of Final Fantasy VI or 3, which I do plan on purchasing pretty soon, so it's clear to me that I am not the target audience for this system, as somebody who owns over 150 original Super Nintendo games and many of which are difficult to find, expensive or downright obscure. This system does not target me as a consumer. However, that doesn't mean that I cannot be critical of its selection of games, which is excellent but exceptionally small, given the system's overall library of quality games. In fact, and people are not going to like what I have to say from here on out, I'm far more concerned about which games are not on the system rather than the ones that are. Now, I think that on Nintendo's end, it was a wonderful decision to include the previously unreleased Star Fox 2. That was a fantastic decision. Another excellent move on Nintendo's end is introducing Earthbound, Final Fantasy III, and Super Mario RPG to a broader audience. However, I firmly believe that Nintendo should have expanded on this a hell of a lot more. For example, they should have introduced American players to the amazing, incredible Terranigma, especially since the US did get the first 2 installments in the Heaven and Earth series, as well as the 4th installment, Groundstream Saga, on the PS1. This would have been a fantastic opportunity for Nintendo to introduce American players to the Twinbee series. Or perhaps introduce them to The Fireman, another very interesting and rather original SNES title. In fact, they could have also brought over Doremi Fantasy, which is one of the most beautiful platformers on the system and is a Japanese exclusive. So introducing that masterpiece of a game to a broader audience through the SNES Classic would have been amazing. Speaking of beautiful platformers, they could have tried to, albeit it would have been expensive and probably not possible, license the 3rd installment in the Mickey Mouse Magical Quest series. We got that on the GBA, but the SNES version is absolutely brilliant. However, I understand why that is not on the system. And what truly irritates me about the selection of games on the SNES Classic is the omission of some key first-party titles, which I don't understand why they wouldn't include them. For example, they included Super Mario World and Yoshi's Island, both wonderful games, yet they somehow chose not to have Super Mario All-Stars on there. Why would they do that? Even worse, we have Kirby Superstar or Kirby Deluxe or whatever you want to call it, yet the wonderful, magical, amazing Kirby 3 is nowhere to be found. It also makes absolutely no sense to me that the first Donkey Kong Country is on the system, yet the 2nd and 3rd game in this outstanding series are once again nowhere to be found. When it comes to third-party games, Japan got the first Goemon game on their SNES Mini. So why didn't Nintendo try to license the game for European and American releases, especially when the game was already released in both markets on cartridge? And if they really wanted to, they could and should have tried to license the 2nd game in the series, which is an absolute masterpiece, and I just can't get enough of it. I play it all the time. And given how import-friendly Goemon 2 is, they didn't even have to translate it. You know, they could have had this sort of little section in the SNES Classic where it's, Japan exclusive games, and we could have had Doremi Fantasy, we could have had Goemon, we could have had a hell of a lot more games on there. Because the system does have enough space to house a ton of games. Now guys, don't get me wrong. I don't believe that Nintendo should have tried to license all my obscure, weird Japanese releases, because I know that's impossible. Alright, I don't expect them to do that. But I do think that there were plenty of games they could have licensed and introduced to broader audiences. Introducing different games across different regions would have made the system even more important for gaming history as a whole. In fact, the release of the SNES Classic could have brought some Satellaview exclusives to broader audiences. Heck, we recently got a physical release after so many years of this fun and addictive action game called Kaizo Chojin Shubibiman, which was previously a Satellaview exclusive. So to have this in my hands as a physical, officially released cartridge is just amazing. And I play the game all the time. I don't keep it sealed in its box. And I'm sure that Nintendo could have gotten the license for this game to be released on the SNES Classic, and I firmly believe that its developers would have been beyond happy to have their game be a part of the SNES Classic selection of built-in games. For a system that comes with 2 controllers, the SNES Classic sure lacks in good, high-quality, high-end 2-player games. If you ask me, the first Pocky and Rocky, Sonic Blastman 2, Sunset Riders, and Run Saber should have been on this system. At least one of them should have been on the system, somehow. I don't know how, but Nintendo should have tried and gotten the license for these games. Because they're outstanding 2-player games, all of them. Or they could have licensed Wild Guns. I mean, Wild Guns got a PS4 release recently, so I'm sure that its developers wouldn't have had a problem with negotiating a decent price for Nintendo to put the game on the SNES Classic. Now, I fully understand that our beloved Turtles in Time would have been exceptionally expensive and difficult to license. And I know that it probably would have been impossible for Nintendo to get a license for this game, but maybe they should have tried, if they haven't already. Because imagine having that wonderful game, it's probably one of the best, if not the best, beat-em-ups of all time, be a part of this system, right? That would have been perfect, and best of all, the game actually works on the SNES Classic perfect. In my opinion, the SNES Classic could have used an even stronger single-player lineup of games, because if you think about it, this is the type of system that requires pick-up-and-play games. Games such as Ninja Warriors, Pokken Rocky, the second one, Hagane, they all would have been absolutely brilliant for the SNES Classic. I understand that those games probably weren't the easiest to license, but maybe it wasn't impossible to get them licensed. Seeing as how Super Turrican, both games, were recently licensed to be used in the Super NT, I'm sure that Nintendo could have tried to get a license for the games for use with the SNES Classic as well. And it's a real shame too, because both games are two of the best action games on the platform. In fact, I prefer Turrican to Contra a hell of a lot more. Other games that could have been probably fairly easy to license were the Joint Mac games. After all, they recently got a re-release on actual cartridge, so perhaps Nintendo could have tried to get those games on the system, even though they are not the best the SNES has to offer. The Super Nintendo library of games is beyond rich and diverse. It has everything from beat-em-ups to shmups, from platformers to adventure games, RPGs, and all sorts of wonderful action games. And I understand that it was downright impossible to have many of these games licensed, or maybe some were too expensive to license, maybe some slipped Nintendo's mind. However, I can't help but feel that Nintendo could have done a lot better with their built-in selection of games. Rather, their selection of games is excellent, but it's way too small given how big, how vast the Super Nintendo library actually is. I don't believe that choosing to include some of the first-party titles they choose to omit would have increased the price of the system. After all, they're first-party titles and Nintendo is a multi-billion-dollar company. I also don't believe that choosing to license a few more games would have drastically increased the price of the system, if at all, because once again, Nintendo is a very, very wealthy corporation. So if they really wanted to put effort into this, they could have done it. And they could have offered some amazing, amazing games to choose from. Now I'm going to say something that people are going to disagree with even more. I believe that Nintendo's lack of interest in providing the best possible gameplay experience with the SNES Classic outside its exterior physical appearance also shows in the emulator they used to run the games on. For the most part, emulation is very good and it upscales to HD fairly well. Of course, it's nowhere near as good as what the Super NT does, but considering that's a hardware device and not an emulator, it's understandable, and it's nowhere near as good as what RetroArch, for example, can do on PC with its wonderful filters, but once again, the PC has a hell of a lot more horsepower than the SNES Classic. So, for what it is, the SNES Classic does a wonderful job at upscaling SNES games to HD, and with the addition of scan lines, they really do look very nice. However, one of Nintendo's most important games on the system, Yoshi's Island, suffers from a bug that clearly could have been fixed if somebody actually sat down and playtested the game. I don't believe that these games were ever properly playtested, or the people testing the games didn't have original hardware to compare them to, and not knowing what they were supposed to look like on original hardware, they just assumed that this bug was part of the game, or that that's how the game was even on original hardware. And to me, this is unforgivable. This isn't something that I can just look past and say, hey, you know what, Nintendo made a mistake, it's just one game. I don't know what happens in those RPGs they have, because I'm not going to replay Super Mario RPG when I just finished it on actual hardware just to test it all. You know what, I don't trust Nintendo's emulator with this, seeing as how in the first few levels of Yoshi's Island there is already a rather jarring and unpleasant to look at glitch that was not fixed and could have been easily fixed. So is the SNES Classic a decent alternative to the original Super Nintendo or the very expensive and absolutely fantastic Super NT? Fact of the matter is that Nintendo could have done a hell of a lot better with the emulation and selection of games. However, the system can be very easily modified to play pretty much any Super Nintendo ROM out there. Now, it can use the default emulator that comes with the system, or you can add different emulators that have broader support for different games. With this in mind, this SNES Classic is a fairly decent, but not the best, emulation device. And given its excellent controllers and very appealing physical appearance, it's definitely something to consider purchasing, but only if you can get it at its original retail price and not pay scalpers double the price, because if you're going to pay 200 euros or $200 for this, you might as well invest in a Super NT and a flash card. Yes, it's going to run you a hell of a lot more, but it's going to be much better than what the SNES Classic has to offer. However, as a fairly cheap alternative to the SNES, which runs games in HD fairly decently, I would say that yes, the SNES Classic is worth buying. I personally wouldn't have bought one, but I got mine for free, so that's why I have it. However, I believe that people who want to learn more about the Super Nintendo or just want to relive their childhood should give this system a chance and strongly consider modifying it so that they can truly experience the SNES library in all its glory.